Thanks a lot, Doran, and thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be back in Geary. It doesn't feel like a long time since I left, and it's lovely to see some familiar faces. And so, as Doran says, I'm going to be presenting work with Orla today. So, Orla, I'm sure, would be happy to answer any very difficult questions that I can't answer at the end of this. Okay, so let's get started. So, I'm just going to quickly talk about what I'm going to present today. So, I'm going to start by just giving a bit of context to the overall study, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation and the contribution of the paper, a little bit about the randomized control trial design that we use here in this study and its implementation. And obviously I'm going to then talk a lot about the results and discuss their implications and sort of some of the limitations of the paper. And we're in the process of revising the paper, so we'd really appreciate any comments, questions. Really looking forward to the Q&A at the end, so I'm definitely going to try and finish bang on time so there's time for questions. Okay, so let's talk about the context. Well, the background to this is that Orla and I were approached by a large Irish public sector organisation back at the end of 2020. So, like many organisations in Ireland at the time, and indeed across the world, they'd switched to working from home due to COVID-19. The management were really concerned about the impact of working from home on organisational climate, on employee morale, and on general employee wellness and well-being. So what they did to try and get a head start on this issue is they set up a dedicated wellness committee. And sort of some of the things that they had done by the time that we met with them was they'd set up a newsletter and they had run 7 online webinars at that stage. And the purpose of these webinars was to reduce social isolation and enhance employees' personal development by basically encouraging employees to come together in a sort of an informal social environment to learn a new skill. But the problem was they had no idea whether they were having any impact or not because they hadn't evaluated any of the events that they had run previously. So they were very keen to work with us to adopt a more systematic approach to, first of all, measuring worker well-being, and secondly, testing and evaluating worker well-being initiatives and events in their organisation. Okay, so this is the larger project that you can see here on the screen. So the first thing that we did was we worked with them to basically redesign their annual employee survey. And what we did was we ensured that evaluated worker wellbeing indicators were inserted so that we have a wide range of outcome measures that we now have at baseline. And then in the future, as part of our future work, we hope to then remeasure at a later stage. What we also did was we included some qualitative questions, just asking them about their awareness of wellness initiatives, their perceptions in terms of how well it was working, what they'd like to see more of. And to follow up on that analysis, we also ran a focus group in July 2021, where we had a smaller group of employees from all across the organisation. And we basically asked them questions like, what's the most stressful thing about your job? What do you like most about your job? What would you like to see more from the wellness team? What's stopping you from participating in wellness initiatives to date? So that's sort of the needs analysis component of the project. And what this needs analysis threw up was that there was definitely, we did a thematic analysis, and there was definitely a few themes that were sort of cropping up from this analysis. The first was general feelings of social isolation, as you'd expect, and as many employees experienced during lockdown. There was also the feeling that this particular organisation was quite siloed, in that if you were in one particular division or department, you might not necessarily know anybody else in the organisation. And a general lack of sort of connectedness, particularly for people who might have joined more recently and hadn't had a chance to sort of get to know a lot of people in the organisation. Interestingly, what we also found was that there was a very high awareness of these wellness events that were being run, but very low attendance. So if you just this graph just gives you a bit more detail on that part. So what it tells you from the survey that we did, 85% of employees had never participated in one of these live wellbeing webinars. And they were recorded, and all staff had access to the recorded versions later on, but only 81% had never accessed the recorded version either. So it's not like that they were all flocking to look at the recorded version. So you can see very low engagement in general with the previous webinars. So the next stage was there was 2 problems at hand here. The first was the ultimate aim is to obviously try and target worker wellness and to boost that. But the intervening step was how do you get people to actually show up to these types of events? And that's what this study and this paper is dealing with today. So what we have done in this stage is we ran a randomized controlled trial, which was aimed specifically at boosting attendance at online personal development and social events. And then the last sort of section of this graph here is what we're hoping will be our future work, which is to work with the organisation to actually test using a number of RCTs, actual interventions which directly target worker wellbeing. But we're not at that stage yet. In terms of this paper today, we're at the stage of the circle around it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the motivation and the contribution of this particular paper. So this organisation was not on its own in terms of investing substantial time and money in events and initiatives aimed at safeguarding worker wellness and developing personal skills. So if we leave the question of the content of these events aside for a moment, and this is something which I'll come back to a bit later, but the content notwithstanding, the effectiveness of these types of events and initiatives in terms of reach and impact is going to be always bounded by participation levels. And what the literature tells us is that attendance is typically pretty low. So even when you're talking about a very structured worker wellbeing program, the median participation rates across the globe would typically be in the region of 30 to 40%. But when you're talking about one-off events like the type I'm going to describe here today, attendance rates would typically be a lot lower than that again. So one of the things that came out of the literature was that behaviourally informed nudges have been used to increase attendance in other contexts. So this got us to thinking about whether they might be able to be used in this particular context. But when we went and did the research, it was obvious that the effectiveness of nudges in this type of a context has actually never been tested. So that's sort of the gap where this paper comes in to fill. So in terms of the problem that's addressed in this particular study, as I've already said, an analysis of the baseline data reveals high awareness in relation to these events, but historically very low attendance rates. So that's kind of the nub of the problem that this paper seeks to address. So what we found is that there was an average attendance of approximately 200 employees at the previous 7 virtual events. So that's just 1.5% of the total workforce. So obviously far from ideal. At the same time, from the very first meeting we had with the organisation, it was clear that there were going to be a number of constraints that we were going to face in terms of working with them on an RCT. And this is the same, I'm sure, for anybody who works with a large organisation. The first is very limited budget. The second, which was might be just particular to them, I'm not entirely sure, or it could be a public sector thing, is that there were no incentives to be used. So they did not want to incentivise employees to attend these events by offering monetary or even non-monetary gifts. That was off the table. They also wanted no employees to be excluded. So this meant from the design of the RCT, all employees would have to be involved. So we couldn't have a sort of a waitlist scenario. It had to be everybody or nothing, essentially. And also they made it very clear, and this sort of has implications for the paper in general, that we needed to work with wellness events that were already in the pipeline, so that they already had decided that they were going to run. So the question was then, given these constraints, how might attendance at personal development events be increased? Okay, so for anybody who's a behavioural scientist, I'm not sure if anybody, if there are many here, but as a behavioural scientist, one of the sort of the obvious things that will come to mind, given those constraints, was to think about maybe using a behaviourally informed nudge. So for those of you who don't know what a nudge is, I'm just going to give you the classic definition here, which comes from the famous book Nudge, written by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. You can see the picture there. It's so popular that people actually bring it on their summer holidays. You can see somebody posting a little picture of them with the palm trees. So they define a nudge as any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behaviour in a predictable way, without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. And so importantly, to count as a mere nudge, an intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates. So I think that gives you a feel for what a nudge is and what it isn't. And the idea of a nudge is nudges should help people to make better choices as judged by themselves. And it's the as judged by themselves bit that's really important here. It's a very subjective concept. So it's essentially, nudges are designed to be increase people's autonomy and not reduce it from that perspective. So I've already referred to choice architecture, because choice architecture is intrinsically linked with the idea of nudges. Choice architecture is a term coined by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. You can see up here the pictures of them. And choice architecture essentially refers to the environment or context in which a behaviour takes place. And it's very closely related to the sociological concept of framing. So the idea here is that there are multiple ways to present a choice to a decision maker. And crucially, there is no neutral architecture. So any way an option is presented is going to influence the decision maker's choice. So the implication for us then was that the idea is that by changing how the invitation to these personal development events was presented or framed, we could potentially positively influence the employee's decision to attend. So why nudges? Well, nudges are low cost, which is obviously going to be appealing to organizations. They're relatively simple to implement. They're particularly useful for tackling psychological barriers to action. And also, importantly, they sit at the softer end of the intervention continuum. So again, that makes them more appealing in an organizational setting. Effect sizes do tend to be relatively low. So a recent meta-analysis done by Bashir and Kozowski talked about effect sizes in the range of 2 to 5%. But on the basis of impact per unit of cost incurred, nudges are regarded as a valuable tool for changing behavior. So you get a lot of bang for your buck, essentially, with a nudge, if it's done right and if it works well. Also, importantly, there's a burgeoning behavioral economics literature that shows that nudges can be very effective at boosting participation and attendance in a whole load of contexts. So particularly in health context, it's been examined in terms of clinics, in terms of screening clinics, in terms of vaccination. It's been widely tested and shown, various nudges have been shown to be very effective in increasing engagement levels and participation in those contexts. Also in an educational context, it's been used to try and get groups of students who might historically have had issues with attending to attend, typically by nudging the parents actually in a lot of cases. And also in legal contexts where it's been used to try and get witnesses to show up at court essentially. However, to date, the workplace context in relation to attendance has been largely ignored. So the aim of this paper was to address 3 research questions. The first of these was, can employees be nudged into attending workplace personal development social events? If so, which nudges are the most and which are the least effective? And finally, are nudges effective in boosting attendance amongst harder to reach subgroups? So for example, men or less senior employees. So these are the groups that the literature has identified may be less likely to attend worker wellness events in general. Okay, great. So the contribution of the paper. So to date, there's been really few studies that have examined interventions aimed at boosting employee participation at workplace personal development or social events. And there have been no experiments that we know of anyway, which test whether nudges are effective in boosting attendance at these types of events. So what we do is we use a rigorous pre-registered RCT design to show that nudges can boost overall employee attendance at workplace personal development events and also extend the reach of these events. And so our findings have important implications for organizations who are seeking to boost the impact of their workplace events and also who are seeking to reduce the inefficiencies and improve returns on investment of workplace personal development programs. Our study also obviously contributes to the behavioral economics and nudge literature. And the way it does this is that nudges are by definition highly contextual. But to date, the workplace as a test site for experimental nudge interventions remains highly underutilized. So I'm just going to quote from Lars Tummers here, who's a professor in the University of Utrecht and who's one of the gods of behavioral science and nudging in general. And what he says is that sometimes nudges are quite effective. Other times they fail or even backfire. Hence, the effectiveness of nudges is not straightforward. So what he says is that field experiments where a random set of people receive the nudge and others do not are paramount in testing whether a nudge works in a particular situation. And he finishes by saying, do not assume that what works in one situation will work in another, test and test often. And that's kind of the sentiment that informs this study. Okay, so now is everyone with me? Has anybody got any questions? Everyone understands? Okay, cool. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the randomized control test design or trial design. Okay, so a little bit about the research site itself. So as I've already said, it's a large Irish public sector organisation. There were 7,200 workers employed at the time. And the workforce is predominantly female and 62% female. It's a relatively older workforce in terms of 83% of the employees are aged between 30 and 60. and an average tenure of 13 years, which I guess in a public sector context probably wouldn't be that unusual. And the type of work that they do was predominantly desk-bound, office-type works. So the organisation had multiple sites across the country, and at the time of this study, 90% of them were working from home full-time or part-time. So a little bit now on the events that these this particular intervention was targeting. So as I say, we had no input in these events. We had to deal with the next set of events that were coming down the pipeline, essentially. So what these were 3 personal development events that were organised as part of the organisation's annual Equality and Inclusion Week, which is held every year between the 20th of November and the 25th of November. So the first event was a 30-minute introduction to sign language. The second event was a 60-minute cook-along with a chef from Healthy Workforce Ireland, accompanied by a sign language interpreter. So that was sort of the diversity equality bit. And the final event was a 30-minute lunch and learn human rights talk to provide employees with a simple overview of the rights which we are all entitled to in the workplace, and to give them some tips to sort of help them create a more inclusive and equal environment for all of their colleagues, essentially. So 3 events all run in 1 week, all at lunchtime, and all virtual. So the first thing that we had to, the first question that was really important when trying to design a nudge intervention was, what determines attendance in the first place, both in a wellness and in a wider context, essentially. And so we sort of scoured the literature to sort of answer this question. And what we found was that there's a general consensus that you have individual and organisation level factors which sort of influence each other and which are both important. So at an individual level, you have things like the individual's own motivation, their own baseline well-being levels, their personality, their preferences for attending these types of events, the opportunity cost, and perhaps they are too busy at work and they just haven't got the time to go to an event like this, and substitutes in terms of what else could they do with this lunchtime slot, essentially.
Have you checked whether the events were held during lunchtime? Because then the opportunity cost will be great.
So, all of these events were held at lunchtime. These 3 events.
I'm asking, yeah. Have you checked whether they were organized at lunchtime?
I'm not entirely, I don't understand.
If an event is organized during lunchtime,
yeah,
then it is less likely that people will have time to prefer to have a lunch rather than 30 minutes of sign language or stuff like that.
Yeah, the reason they were held at lunchtime was that we did get feedback that because there was a very high work burden placed on a lot of the employees, and there was a lot of feedback that they wouldn't actually be able to get away to attend an event like this if it wasn't held at lunchtime. So I think there is a trade-off. Obviously, there are people who don't want to spend their lunchtime attending this type of event, but I think the overall consensus was that it was better to have them at lunchtime, because if they were held during the day, there'd be a much lower likelihood of people showing up, because then you've got a scenario where you just get subsumed in a task and you just don't get distracted and you forget to show up, or your boss is not going to be happy with you taking off to attend an event like this, perhaps if there's a deadline that's due to be met. So there is, but I take your point that there is a downside to holding them at lunchtime as well.
The problem is that the, let's say, opportunity cost factor will come from all the other factors. So how do you disentangle between the explanations for why somebody won't be able to?
Absolutely, and it impacts preferences as well. I mean, so a lot of people may just have a preference that my lunchtime is my time for myself, and I'm not giving it to the company, essentially. So I totally accept that point. Yeah, absolutely.
And just clarification. So, what were the people doing the rest of the day? Were they on Zoom calls? Like, the jobs were already in meetings.
So yeah, we were getting a lot of feedback that they were on a lot of Zoom calls. So and obviously that's going to impact the appeal of a virtual wellness event as well. I mean, if you've been on Zoom calls all day, maybe the last thing you want to do is go on to another Zoom call at your lunchtime. But I guess it was trying to address the overall arching question of the people just feeling isolated on Zoom calls just with their own particular team, maybe. And the idea was to try and get people from different parts of the organisation to maybe come together in a informal environment and to kind of just shoot the breeze a little bit while learning something new, essentially. That was kind of the aim. Yeah, but I agree. There's so many different things that influence attendance in this particular context, and undoubtedly the amount of time spent on Zoom that day probably influenced who showed up to the event. And it could vary day by day, hour by hour even. And then on the organizational side, we have factors like how the events were communicated or marketed, and how easy they were to attend. And we had got feedback from the baseline analysis that actually the events were difficult to attend. There was a very clunky registration process, which we will talk about a little bit in a few minutes. Things like organisation size, contextual factors like where it was held, when it was held, as you've correctly pointed out, and importantly, perceived organisational support. And so here we're talking about buy-in from management, so it's not just kind of the usual thing that happens in organisations that they all say that they're for employee wellness, but then when you say, I want to take time to go and attend this event, that they go, well, you're not doing that, you've got this thing to finish here. So these are all the factors that basically the literature has identified as separate things. So you can see there's an awful lot there. So obviously we couldn't possibly tackle all of them, so we decided we'd focus more on the organisation level because that was more under our control essentially. So we're targeting sort of some of these boxes with some of the nudges that I'll talk about now. So the second part of designing this intervention was, okay, you know now what influences attendance, but how do you design a good nudge? So what makes a nudge successful? And one of the sort of the easier, sort of simpler models to think about this is the Fogg behavioural model. So some of you may know BJ Fogg from his book Tiny Habits, which was a massive bestseller. So this is just a very simple model, and what Fogg says is that you have to have 3 items converging simultaneously for a nudge to be successful, essentially. So you have to, a nudge has to make things easier, and so it has to increase motivation, and then there also has to be an element where there's a prompting or a triggering, essentially. So you can have a situation where ability and motivation can kind of compensate for each other. So you could have somebody who was really, really motivated, but it was really, really hard to attend the event, then they may just not do it. So by just tweaking and making it a little bit easier, then you can hopefully get that person to attend. So it's a simple model, but it's just a useful framework just for thinking about what can make a nudge more successful. So the next element of the nudge design is obviously, as talked about the needs analysis, so I won't go into that now. Organisational constraints, which I've also alluded to, but there are also quite a lot of IT constraints in terms of sometimes we come up with an idea and we'd float it and they'd say, oh no, that's not going to work with our IT systems, or no, the email system won't allow that, or we don't have access to Zoom, we only have access to Skype, and that won't allow you to do this and that. So anyway, there were IT limitations, and also obviously time and resource constraints, because while you had a very committed wellness team who were really invested in this, and the last thing any of the senior managers wanted was an additional sort of pull on their time, basically. So they didn't really want to get that involved in terms of having to send out emails themselves or anything like that. Also, we obviously did a power analysis, which was useful because it was able to tell us how many treatment arms we'd be able to have. We were going for sort of a minimum effect size of 2 percentage points. And then obviously an extensive literature review, the aim of which was to identify what has worked in the past. And by looking at that, hopefully we could come up with ideas of what might be likely to work in this as yet untested workplace context. Okay, so this sort of took us, this work kind of highlighted a number of potential nudges that we sort of floated with the organisation, and we came up with a short list, and we sort of ended up with the ones that I'm going to talk about now. So for any behavioural science intervention, the starting point is usually simplification, and by simplification I mean making things easier, essentially. So the key idea here is that you want to simplify existing programs. You want to make them more convenient. So complexity has been identified in the literature as one of the biggest barriers to uptake behaviour in general. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to reduce the cost or friction or sludge, whatever word you want to use, of registering and attending one of these events, essentially. And there's loads of examples from the literature as to how this has been applied. So, for example, Bettinger et al. Looked at, they showed that how streamlining the application process increased college enrolment amongst minorities. And more recently, Cuesta et al. In Uruguay showed that by embedding an online scheduling link for cervical cancer screening in their reminder email, doubled the appointment rate for women versus those who were just reminded, and it tripled it versus the control group. So some good effect size there in terms of the types of effect size that you'd expect for a nudge. So the second nudge that we explored and that kind of popped out from the literature was this idea of messenger. So messenger is, the idea with this nudge is to reframe the message, or the invitation in this case, by changing the messenger. And obviously the messenger is just the person who is perceived to be behind the invitation in this case, essentially. So there's sort of a lot of science and theory behind all of this that dates back right to the 1940s, 1950s. But essentially, some of the key points about the messenger is that people are attracted to options that are perceived to be endorsed by someone that they trust, essentially, or someone that they respect, or by someone that they like, or that they perceive to be like themselves. So explicit recommendations have been shown to inform people's behaviour. And what's really important with the messenger is that the messenger needs to be either credible, so authoritative or expert, and or attractive or likable. And when I say attractive, I'm not talking about sort of physically attractive or even necessarily popular, though that can help. It's more that you can see some of you in them, essentially. So there's an element of sort of similarity. So because a message from somebody who you perceive to be more like you has been shown to be more effective. So again, there's some examples from the literature of how the messenger effect has been used. So De Nooijer et al. In Holland, they found that young women who received an email from their own GP or doctor were more likely to attend health screening for cervical cancer. And interestingly, from a workplace perspective, Chohan and Bicknell in 2019, they found that employees who received an encouraging email from an authority source, so for example their boss, were found to be 80% more likely to complete an e-learning course at work. Okay, so on to the next one. So the next nudge that came out of this literature review was social proof, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard of. But just in case you haven't, social proof is essentially where you provide information about other people's choices, and this in turn then influences your decision making. So the aim here is to harness social identity and the power of social norms in particular. So as I'm sure many of you know, descriptive norms refer to the tendency of people to want to do what the majority do. And this has been shown in an economics context as well, where the work of Akerlof and Cranston and Benebow and Tirole, they've shown that utility depends on norms as to how people think that they and others should behave. So there's an element of sort of an injunctive norm element there as well. But either way, people want to behave consistently in a way that's expected of them. So we all kind of want to be accepted and don't want to stick out like a sore thumb for kind of going against the grain to a large extent. And some of the ways that social proof has been shown in the literature to be effective, one of the landmark studies was by Brandon et al. In 2017, where they showed that providing social proof or information about neighbours' energy usage reduced the energy consumption of the treated group. Holdsworth et al. So Holdsworth is one of the guys who set up the Nudge Unit in the UK. They did a really interesting study that showed that providing doctors with information about other doctors' prescribing behaviour actually reduced overprescribing. So because they were trying to address the problem of antibiotics being prescribed. And then Bell and Cantarelli, again in a workplace context, they recently showed that providing social proof about co-workers' behaviour increased vaccination uptake and on-the-job help-seeking behaviours. So some good evidence there as well.
This might be quite context-specific in the sense that some societies are very conformist. And people do it at home.
I was talking to Liam Delaney, who's my other supervisor, and who knows a huge amount about nudges. He's convinced that social proof doesn't work in an Irish context. He says he's yet to find an effective study that shows that social proof works. And so we haven't. That's just his opinion, but I think he probably knows better than most people. And it could be, we don't know why that is, but it would be an interesting thing to test. Maybe it's to do with the Irish people being essentially maybe it's to do with your, I don't know, our historical past or something. It'd be an interesting thing to explore. But yeah, absolutely. Social norms work better in some countries than others, and some cultures and some organisations better than others as well.
Yeah, in COVID we were considered to be a very compliant.
I know. Yeah, that's because we had this discussion when he raised that point. But he said he doesn't think that's to do with social norms. It's to do with more a genuine sense of community and caring for your neighbour, as opposed to just wanting to be seen to do the right thing. But who knows? An interesting question, though. And then finally, we come to the big daddy of defaults, which is defaults. So the idea of a default is that people are assigned to a pre-selected default option, but they always retain the option to opt out. And to opt out has to be relatively cost-free and easy, otherwise it doesn't meet the definition of a nudge. So defaults exploit established behavioural economics concepts and mechanisms which refer to sort of cognitive biases that I don't have time to go into now, but basically they include things like inertia, loss aversion, present bias, and procrastination. So all of these things are targeted by this default nudge. And how do they work? Well, they work because they're often perceived as recommendations, and they've been shown to be effective in many, many settings. So Jakimich did a big meta-analysis in 2019 and found that defaults were basically effective in a ton of different contexts. And so sort of the headline example that's been used, and it's probably the most famous example of a nudge of all time, is basically the fact that default enrollment has been so effective in increasing employee participation in salary-linked savings accounts and pension schemes. We've also seen it being used more recently in terms of flu vaccination. So Katie Milkman did a massive mega study very recently, and default, so schemes where people had to actually default out of being given an appointment for a flu vaccination proved to be quite effective. They've also been used to increase screening participation rates. And finally, the last sort of stream which isn't a treatment per se, but we do use it. I'm not going to go into it too much today because there isn't enough time probably, but we're cognizant of the fact that reminders were a very large part of the literature, and that if you think back to the FOG model, okay, you can have motivation and you can have ability, but he certainly would be of the view that you also need a reminder or something at the trigger point to get people to actually remember what they wanted to do in the first place. So the idea of a reminder is obvious. People need to be reminded or prompted to take action. And this ties into the idea of an intention behaviour gap. That's very documented in the literature. So people may intend to take an action, but they just haven't found the right moment, or maybe they've just forgotten. And indeed, forgetting to schedule an appointment is one of the key barriers to attendance that's been identified in the literature, particularly in relation to things like cervical screening. So these studies all relate to cervical screening, so there's been a lot done in over the last few years on that. And then ways that it's been used to increase attendance and participation is, and there was a famous study by Altman and Traxler in 2014 where they issued postcard reminders to people about their dental checkups, and that increased the likelihood of making and completing an appointment by 10 percentage points, which is a large effect for this literature. And similarly, more recently, Katie Milkman, as I said, used SMS text reminders to increase flu vaccination rates by 3 percentage points. Okay, so any questions on that part of it? Okay, cool. Okay, I'll just talk about a little bit about the implementation. I won't spend too long on this. So obviously there was a number of stages. Obviously the first stage was UCD ethics approval, and then we also had to get board approval from the organisation themselves. We then pre-registered the RCT. The next step was the randomisation process. So let's see a bit more detail here. So we used a simple individual probability randomisation strategy with no blocking, no stratification, and what essentially happened was workers' email addresses were used to randomly assign them to 5 conditions. And then we have a second randomization, which you can see down there, the second random allocation circle, which is, so the people that were pre-assigned to the default group were then further randomly assigned to one of the 3 events. So you have a two-stage randomization process. And then the next step was to design and send out the initial invitation emails. That was on the 4th of November. And finally, the last step was to send out the reminder email. And that was sent out 24 hours before the first event was due to start on the 16th of November. And again, we did a lot of toing and froing on what the appropriate timing was for the reminder email, because there's a lot of mixed results in the literature, but it seemed to be that 24 hours was probably, for this type of an event, probably a fairly good compromise.
The reminder was sent to everyone or just to the treatment?
To everybody. So everybody in the organisation received a reminder, though the content slightly varied, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but everyone did get one.
So just how transparent was it to the participants that they were involved in?
Yeah, so obviously we didn't want to make it very transparent to them that they were in an experiment, but then we kind of met some opposition from the ethics board. So the compromise was that there was a little wording had to be inserted into every email that basically said information about attendance and participation rates will be used will be analysed and will be used to make improvements to worker wellness events going forward. So it didn't expressly say you were part of an intervention, but it did say if you are not happy for your information to be included or you want to opt out, you can let us know. And I think 2 people came back and said that they didn't want their information to be used. So yeah, and that was something that is always going to be a tension between the ethics boards and when you're trying to run an experiment. So that was about as good as we could get, essentially. And Leo.
To keep it short,
We don't have any idea, unfortunately, because we weren't responsible for either doing the randomization itself or sending out any of these emails, and that was a part of the ethics requirement as well, that we were very much standing back from a data anonymity and privacy perspective. So we don't. I mean, I'm sure they possibly did, and I'm sure there was a lot of, I'm going to this cook along on Tuesday, do you fancy coming along? It might be a bit of a laugh, but we can't track that, unfortunately. This just shows that randomization worked. Very simple tests to show that basically the employees were well split over the 5 conditions by gender and by grade and seniority. Okay, so I'll just show you the exact emails that were used now. So as I said, we had 1 control and 4 treatments plus the reminder, which I won't talk too much about today. So the control group and the simplification group, they essentially got the same email, which I'm going to show you here. So now again, we had no input into this. This email was the standard email that was used by the organization before we were ever contacted. So they wanted to keep everything as close to sort of the baseline conditions as possible. So the only difference between the control and the simplification treatments, if you see the yellow bit that's highlighted there, so in the control group, they got the old style registration process. So when they clicked, so it says please click on here, when they clicked, they were taken into a separate email window. So they then had to populate the email saying, I want to attend this event, please sign me up. And they had to put in the email address and send that off essentially. So we'd already had feedback from employees that they found this whole thing quite clunky, and a lot of them just gave up because they just couldn't be bothered. I know it sounds like a really small step, but what the nudge literature does tell us is that the smallest of steps can put people off essentially. So this is what we were testing essentially by changing this particular step in the simplification treatment. And what we do is, for the simplification group, when they clicked on here, they got an embedded registration link, which took them immediately to a Qualtrics page, and all they had to do was just tick the event, a box beside the event that they wanted to attend. They were then automatically registered, and they didn't have to do anything else essentially. They were sent an email with the Zoom or Skype details and closer to the time. So what we're manipulating here between the control and simplification is essentially the mechanics of the registration process, if you like. Okay, so the next treatment was the messenger treatment. So again, the wording was very similar. There was just in yellow, you'll see this is additional wording that we put in, and this says that I'm sure you'll agree that this is an important initiative that I, for one, am really looking forward to. So I suppose a kind of an endorsement. I'm excited to announce our live events. And then she says, if you would like to join me in supporting this important initiative by registering your interest, please click on here. And all of the other treatments had the embedded registration link. So that's just important to point out. And it was signed by the Assistant Secretary. That was the messenger treatment, essentially. And we have the social proof. Now, it's important to point out the social proof treatment was actually operationalized using the reminder email. So the social proof people got the same initial email as the simplification group, but they got a different reminder email. And because obviously we needed to know the amount of people that had signed up, so that's why we couldn't give the social proof in the first email, because we didn't know, we had nobody registered at that stage. So we had to use the reminder email to operationalize social proof. And what we say is, again, in yellow, you can see the difference. So it says 231 of your colleagues have already expressed their support for this important initiative by securing their places. Why didn't you join them by clicking on here? So there's the social proof that's being provided essentially in line 2. And then finally, we have the default. So the default email looked like this. So very similar to the simplification email, except that you can see in yellow, they're told, we're pleased to inform you that you've been specially selected to attend the Introduction to Sign Language event, and you'll be sent a link to the live event 24 hours before it commences. Alternatively, if you would prefer to switch to one of the other 2 events or to not attend any of the events, please click on here. And again, clicking on here took them to an embedded Qualtrics page. It was really easy. All they had to do was literally unclick the box that they had been assigned to and click another box if they wanted to switch, or just leave it unclicked. So it was a pretty costless process, and again, it had to be to meet the definition of a nudge, essentially. So that's, anybody got any questions on those? Yeah.
You said that the simplification, like the social norm message, for example, was a mix of simplification and social norm message, is that right? Because the link was also the embedded link.
Yes. So basically, you can think of all of the treatments, apart from the control group, obviously. So there was simplification, and then the other 3 are simplification plus, essentially. And that is, has its pluses and its minuses, because when you're analysing it, obviously you have to try and disentangle the two. What we do in the paper is we actually we compare the treatments to control, but we also compare them to simplification as well to see if there's differences. I just can't go into that now, but it's a very valid point, and it's one that it's an important one to acknowledge.
So just on the social group image, is there something kind of like it's quite contingent on there actually being an objective large amount of people participants are? So had that been 10, then it would be presumably considered. You would have anticipated it to be that much or going to be a board.
Well, I'm going to talk about this at the end, but actually 231 is pretty small as well in the context of 7,200. So I mean that's the problem with social proof is it's a gamble, because you don't know in advance how many people are going to have registered. And you're absolutely correct. The effectiveness of the nudge rests on this number. So what this number is, and more importantly, what people perceived what this number should be, affects everything essentially. So yeah, I mean it could have been 3, or it could have been 600. So we had no idea, so it was a gamble, and as it happens, it didn't really work in this instance. But we'll sort of talk about that a little bit later. I'll talk about that.
In an ideal world, we would have lied.
Unfortunately, you're not allowed to do that.
Well, the option there to just fabricate a
No.
number for 10,000 people.
No, we couldn't.
We
So
weren't allowed to lie.
Yeah.
Did you even fake? Colleagues, that is
well, this is an issue, and actually, Kanika, we discussed this in the paper. Actually, what we could have done and probably should have done was used a dynamic social norm, which we weren't that afraid with at the time. But the literature since, it's only a relatively new concept. It's basically where you say, okay, it's not a large number, but it's increased a lot since the last time. Essentially, so you kind of give an indication that it's a trend, that you're part of an increasing trend of people attending, and usually you would do that if you expect the number to be quite low. So if we were doing it again, we probably would include a dynamic social norm as well as this one, probably, to see if there was a difference. Because, but yeah, these are sort of the things you learn after the event. But yeah, if I was doing it again, another trial, I would probably use a dynamic social norm.
Then I don't understand whether you measure on the people who are actually attending or who are registering.
You're going to see this now. Next slide. So 2 outcomes. So we are measuring registrations in terms of the number of people registering for one or more of the live events, and it's important that we emphasize that it's the actual live events that we're recording here, and also the number of people attending one or more live events. And the reason we have both outcomes is that this allows us to measure the intention behavior gap, because we are sort of using registrations almost as a proxy for intentions in this scenario. So we're trying to see, are certain nudges really good at getting people to register, but then maybe not so good at converting those registrations into attendance, essentially. So they are the 2 outcomes that we use. And so just talk about the results. So the first result is obviously registrations. So we found that 1,708 individuals registered for one or more events, so 24% of the workforce. Of those, obviously the largest amount are going to be the default group, because they were all pre-registered. So the vast majority of that 1,708 refers to them. So we're left with 367 employees who actually voluntarily self-registered themselves, which is approximately 6.5% of the workforce. And of the people who were in the default group and who were pre-registered, what we found was actually very few of them opted out. So we had 16 who switched to another event, and we had 78 who opted out entirely. So in the greater scheme of things, that was actually lower, given that, as I said, it was quite cost-free to opt out. It wasn't a difficult process. But it just shows you that defaults are sticky. And here is, this table basically sets out the penalised logistic regression marginal effects associated with being in each treatment group versus the control. And the reason we use a penalised logistic regression is that it's very useful where you have a dependent variable, which is a binary dependent variable. So in this case, registered yes or registered no. Where you have a very small amount of observations in the more rare of the 2 events, essentially. What this does is it reduces small sample bias, essentially. So that's why it's used in the paper. And so what we find is that relative to the control group, all of the treatments were effective at increasing registrations. However, the simplification effect wasn't significant, but the other 3 were. And obviously, no surprise, the default treatment is by far the strongest effect. So we had a net sort of effective registration rate in the default group of 95.6%. So in terms of attendance then, we had 289 employees who attended one or more events, so 4%. Now 4% it probably still sounds quite disappointing and small, but when you look at it in the context of what the historic baseline attendance was, which was 1.5% of the previous 7 events, it's still a decent enough increase. The event does seem to make a difference, because what we found was the cook-along was the most important event, followed by the sign and the human rights talk. So there was discrepancies or differences between the 3 events. Oh, sorry. And here we sort of see again the penalised logistic regression marginal effects. So you can see that simplification and social proof weren't effective at all at increasing attendance. In fact, they marginally decreased attendance relative to the control group. The messenger group was effective, but it wasn't significant. And so the only significant treatment effect here is the default. So the default group was associated with 6.8% higher number of people attending than the control group, essentially. So that's just in simple terms in the graph. So you can see just under 3% of the control group attended, just under 4% of the messenger group attended, and just under 10% of the default group attended. That's right.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, because you controlled different increases in attendance to the different types of events. So this cook-along event, is it something that's more active? So what does it mean? Because the others, they sound as if they're very passive. So you're just listening to it all. Is this something where you actually at home might be cooking? Is there a preparation?
You're supposed to. You got a shopping list and you had to get your ingredients together, and then you prepared. They got diversity in by sort of a few different ethnically diverse dishes were cooked, I think, on the day, and yeah, you had to participate. But also, I think it's just more fun. So I think what we found was that so a lot of when you looked at the events and we analysed the events individually, we found that actually the sign language event attracted the highest number of registrations, but it had the lowest number of conversions. Because, and you think about it, everybody probably feels, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, maybe I'll sign up for that. But then when it comes to it, it's like, oh no, I couldn't be bothered. Whereas with cook-along, if you got it and you've bought the ingredients already maybe, and you're anticipating it might be a bit of crack, then you're probably more likely to convert your intention into an actual behaviour. So I think the events are crucial, and it's sort of an issue that we've sort of struggled with in general with this paper, because we've no control over the events. And I mean, if you were doing it yourself, you'd probably design quite different events. But the idea here, I think, is to try and see, can you use nudges almost regardless of the event, essentially. Now, I know you can't forget the events at the end of the day, but we're trying to see, is there sort of something that might be able to be used for other events as well, essentially. So yeah, but that's a good point about the cook-along. So research would show, as I said at the beginning, that there have been some treatment effects, heterogeneity in relation to different categories of workers in terms of attending wellness events. So this is something we wanted to test using this RCT. So the first thing we looked at was gender. And what we found was that in line with expectations, women were more likely to both register for and attend events than men, so probably no surprise there. And also treated women and treated men were more likely to attend than non-treated women and men. So there you sort of see the heterogeneity kind of dropping out, and that if you were treated, that was sort of the main thing. So you can see in this table here, this is basically just pair t-tests for differences in the number of employees attending between the conditions. The women are in the top row here in black, and the men are in the bottom row in blue. So you can see not that much differences in terms of how attendance interacted with the treatments. So you can see for both groups, essentially, default was the only thing that delivered a significant increase in attendance. So not much heterogeneity there. Here it's just looking at the same thing, but from a regression perspective. So you can see that being treated is significant, and being male is significant in terms of it reduces the likelihood of attending, but being treated and male, so the interaction coefficient is not significant. So we don't find any evidence of a gender treatment interaction effect here. And we looked at the same thing for seniority, and what we found was that, again, in line with previous research, senior employees were more likely to register for and attend events than junior employees. But in this case, treated junior employees, while they were more likely to attend than their control group counterparts, we didn't find attendance treatment effects for treated senior employees. So yeah, so it was limited to the junior employees in this instance. And again, same thing here, junior on the top in black and senior on the bottom in blue. And one difference is that we found that the messenger effect was actually statistically significant, but just for the junior group. And that would sort of maybe imply that there might be some kind of an authority effect going on there. The fact that that had an impact just on the treated junior group. And again, for both groups, you can see that the default was statistically significant and produced a fairly decent increase, or difference, sorry, between the two groups. And again, same thing, whereas treated is significant and being senior is significant, the treated senior interaction coefficient is not. So no evidence of interaction effects. So we'll just summarize the results here then. So the main finding here is that of the 4 treatments, 3 of them didn't work. Defaults did work. And we found the defaults more than tripled attendance rates versus the control. And an interesting part, take home from the study, I think, is that we had such low opt-out rates. So as I said, only 5.5% of the default group opted out when you account for switches. There is evidence, as the literature would suggest, of an intention behaviour gap, in that only 42% of employees who registered for one or more events actually attended that event. And a really interesting finding is that the control group actually had the highest conversion rate. So people in the control group who registered were more likely than any of the treatment groups to actually show up to that event. And in the paper we talk about why that might be the case. And we sort of come to the conclusion that perhaps if you're willing to go through the clunky registration process in the first place, that could be an indication that you're just more motivated to attend that event per se. So that would explain why you had the highest conversion rate for the control group. And not surprisingly, the default group had the lowest conversion rate. And again, I don't think that should probably be surprising to anybody here. The messenger effect is really interesting because as we didn't find it significant, we did find that messenger effect increased attendances, but not significantly. And we speculate in the paper why that might be, and there's a number of reasons why it could be. It could be that we used the wrong messenger, and there's no way of because we don't have the counterfactual of having used another messenger, but she was female. I mean, that could have had an impact. Who knows? Or it could be just that somebody else would have produced a larger effect, essentially. But what we do find, which is really interesting, is that we find that attendance increased significantly in her own division. Sorry. So we find evidence of a local messenger effect. So when you look at the employees who attended, who were also in her same division, they had 31% more employees attending than the control group. So a large and significant local messenger effect going on there. And it could be 2 mechanisms. So it could be an authority figure mechanism at play, whereby if you're in a division and your boss is giving this talk, then maybe you feel kind of obliged. So it's actually not really an option. You kind of feel you have to show up. Or it could be a more positive spin would be that she was very well liked and popular, which we have heard that she was. And though maybe people in her department just wanted to turn up and support her, essentially. So, but again, we don't know. We're just speculating when it comes to that. But I do think the fact that we found that effect is quite interesting. Again, we found that social proof was ineffective. We've talked a little bit about why that might have been the case, and I think it's because probably 231 out of 6998 is not a large number. But the extent to which an objective number is perceived as high or low very much depends on preconception. So we don't know what employees thought was a right or appropriate amount of figure that should be there. So if I'm someone who'd already registered and I get this reminder email telling me that 231 people have signed up, how I react is going to depend on whether I think 231 is large or small, essentially. And if I had expected a lot more people to sign up than that, then maybe that tells me, wait, this event maybe isn't worth showing up to, and I'm not going to show up myself. So then you can have what's called a boomerang effect, where basically your nudge has the opposite effect than what you originally intended, essentially. It could also be that the reminder message was just ignored or not opened because the social proof was only operationalized in the reminder email, so that could be explained as well. Or it could just be that they didn't see the number in the reminder email, but I think it's probably more likely that the reminder message wasn't actually opened, because there is a lot of research that shows that people don't open reminder emails if A, they don't have a strong preference for the event in the first place, or B, they do have a strong preference, but they know that they won't be able to attend because their workload is just too high, so they could just ditch the reminder email, essentially. And as I said, we found limited evidence of treatment effect heterogeneity. So 2 effects we did find is that we found the simplification nudge was more effective at increasing registrations amongst women, And the default nudge was more effective at increasing registrations amongst junior workers. So they were the only significant heterogeneous effects we found. So we found no significant interactions for attendance. But I guess the positive to take out of this is that defaults significantly increased attendance across all of the subgroups that we analysed. So that's positive from an organisational perspective because it shows that they may have wide applicability to target people who historically have been less likely to attend these types of events. So quite a lot of power for the organisation. So last slide. In conclusion to all of this, I think the take home is that there is potential for default nudges to be used by organisations to increase overall attendance at workplace personal development or social events, and to increase attendance of harder to reach groups, thereby increasing event impact or return on investment. However, and there's two big caveats to this whole paper and to these findings in general. The first is obviously generalisability. We don't know whether our results would translate to other workplaces within the public sector and then maybe within the private sector, and then you talk about other countries, etc., etc. And also whether they would translate to more traditional wellness events. And we have talked a little bit about that. I mean, these are not your standard worker wellbeing events, which would typically be more things like mindfulness or meditation or yoga or stress management programs, that kind of thing. So they're kind of like a hybrid. The idea was more, the emphasis was more on the social aspect of bringing people together than the actual content of the event itself per se. So it'd be interesting to see whether it would work in a more typical or traditional wellness event. And then of course the last big point is ethics, and these types of studies have large ethical implications. Obviously the first is, I mean, a lot of people might criticize this study for being paternalistic, and they would argue that organizations have no business in trying to get employees to attend these types of events at all, and that's certainly one line of argument that you come across in the nudge literature all the time. There's also the issue of reactance. So reactance is basically when employees feel that they're being manipulated or that their autonomy is being threatened, and then they will react in the opposite way to which you want them to behave, basically. And so that's something that could be happening here that we just haven't. There's no way of checking or saying for sure whether that was the case here or not. And then finally, of course, if you go back to the definition of nudge that I talked about at the beginning, the whole raison d'etre for a nudge is to improve your well-being as judged by you yourself. So I guess we've no way of knowing whether these types of events increase the employee's welfare or not. So I suppose the holy grail here, where you're trying to get to with this research, is that you have a situation where nudges are used to successfully increase attendance at events that employees themselves retrospectively judge to have increased their welfare. So much so that they would have chosen them themselves if they went back in time and had the option again, essentially. And that's sort of where you really would love to get to in terms of using nudges in this type of a context. So I think the important is to recognise the interplay between content, welfare, and these types of treatments, essentially. And so that's it.